Hello. I am going to talk about language learning, first language versus second language. And I think generally what we're going to conclude from this is that a lot of what has been said about how first and second language learning is different is not so different, but it's because we put up so many. We believe it's different, so we assume that it can't be done or there's a lot of restrictions to it, a lot of complications. But first I want to talk about the theories about how we learn a language. Until the 19th or 20th century, before the era of scientific study of language and linguistics and things like this, there wasn't a lot of thought given to it. People would refer to your intelligence, your capacity, your tolerance for learning. A lot of times it was assumed it was somehow part of your inheritance or your culture that made you superior. I've already talked about culture. We now know that it's opportunity, that we have within us a language acquisition device. Noam Chomsky came up with the idea, Noah Chomsky came up with the idea about 40 years ago at MIT, that we have a language acquisition device. Essentially, we evolved to a point where we became very capable of acquiring language and developing a complex language. Now, we know other animals, everything from whales to parakeets to birds to dogs to squirrels, et cetera, up through the primates, have a capacity for communication. And a lot of that's been attributed to something just automatic, that's genetic. The bird's born with the ability to do certain calls. I think that's questionable. They have to be enculturated into it. What if you're the last bird of your kind and you have some birds hatch, some little chicks or whatever, little birds? I mean, how are you going to pass that on? It's got to go through you. It cannot. If you were to die, they're not going to know how to communicate. The old theories, when they started coming up with theories for language, the first one was la tabla rasa, a blank slate. That the idea that a human mind was a blank slate and that we imprinted things on it through culture. So you learned it all through enculturation. And they call this the behaviorists. Now, if you remember your psychology, behaviorists were people that believed you could teach a rat to find the cheese in a maze through repetition. And as the rat got more practice, he eventually knew how to get through the maze to find the cheese. It was just a matter of being very hungry and constantly searching, and then finally remembering or impressing on the brain all of those movements. And so that a rat could learn how to find cheese, therefore a child could learn how to speak a language. The emphasis there was that, we repeat things to kids, and so they eventually pick them up. They imitate them, and we do it through reinforcement because we either smile or hug them, et cetera, whenever they do the right thing. And there's no question that does happen. But can just simple reinforcement account for all speech? And that looks at verbal behavior just like behavior. You'll behave yourself if you've learned, that you're supposed to be quiet at certain times, or you're supposed to, whatever activity you're expected to do. Now, there's a difference with language. Language teaches you vocabulary, it teaches you syntax, the order of words, and it teaches you all kinds of expressions. And it teaches you tones and the emotion that goes with them, and expressions and nonverbal, facial expressions. Languages are very diverse. You may not know this, but some languages are literally clicking sounds. They go like that, and that's language. in some Polynesian areas. You know, it sounds like we're calling a horse or something, or trying to, you know, enforce getting a cat to show up or something. And those are really you know, that's an interesting theory. Now, what I have on the second slide that deals with the second language acquisition theories, and I'm just going to read these off to you. I don't have the audio with the slide on the same page. But we have the behaviorists, and I always call this the rat in the maze experiments. That human beings produce a language once they've heard it. But we know, interestingly enough, that I will produce a sentence that was never been spoken in the history of mankind. Like, please allow the rat to put the cheese into my bone marrow before it beheads me. Now, if you tell me you've heard this sentence before, I'm going to have a question with that. But the fact is that language is so creative that it's beyond mere behavior. In some studies of apes that use sign language, they've noticed, and you may have heard about Coco, the gorilla that can use sign language. It had a pet cat, and the pet cat died, etc. And they found there was evidence that the gorilla was able to invent new meanings with limited vocabulary because of need. And I can't recite those immediately for you, but I remember it had something to do with the gorilla being sad about a situation. Maybe its cat died or was lost. And so to me, that was very interesting, you know, that there was some creative part of it. So that one aspect means that probably behaviorists cannot account for all language. That sentence I just gave you was never spoken to me before. How did I come up with that? You know, we are more creative with language. You always want to be careful if you try to claim that, you know, humans are so superior to other creatures in every way. Maybe we are, maybe we aren't, you know. Now, there are a couple of other ones in here on this one chart. They talk of behaviorists who very scientifically repetition learn language. Nativists believe you learn the second language very similar to the first language. This would be when you a child moves to the United States and does not go to school, but learns the second language, which is English, by talking to people, by being in the culture. It may not be very academic, but it will be effective. And you're well aware of this. You've talked to people in businesses where they may have a strong accent or they say things a little odd sometimes, and you realize, well, your own ancestors, they didn't speak very good English when they came from Germany. They had to work at it. And they never really mastered it because most of them didn't study it in an academic way. They were here to work. A good example is my wife's grandmother, rest her soul. She passed away about 10 years ago. And she had a German accent because she moved in the United States. I think she was born in the United States, but wasn't exposed to English until she was about 7 or 8 years old in school. And when she learned English, she kept her German accent, you know. Okay, now, the nativists, you will pick up the language. Now, the problem is it's not going to be very academic. You know, a lot of people picked it up just by living in the United States. But that doesn't mean you can write in English. And that's what I'll talk about later, is the thing called cognitive academic language skills, proficiency skills, CALPS, they call it. And that is academic English. A thing called BICS, basic interpersonal communication skills, is street language. And it is not very proper in more formal settings. You know, it's the same as in Appalachian when people say the word ain't. And they say, I ain't going to that. Now, you wouldn't deem that very proper to say that if you were being interviewed on TV, or if you were going to be a teacher, you would avoid that because people would say, well, that person ain't got no sense, you know. But the functionalist is the one that kind of interests me a lot. Now, that's the third one. So we got the behaviorists with the rats in a maze, the nativists who basically say you learn the language by living in the culture, and the functionalists who say that you learn the second language and you want to be more formal in this situation, you have to have comprehensible input, interaction, and you have to be able to negotiate meaning. So what does this mean? This means that if you're in a formal setting where you get both the street language or the playground English, the BICS, but you get the CALPS too, which means you read books in English, and you may be a Spanish speaker. We do know in dual language that it's reading is reading. So if you learn to read in your own first language, it's easier to read in a second language because the processing skills are very similar. You know, you may read in different directions of the text, may right to left or from the back of the book to the front of the book, like in Japanese. But the point is that once you know to read, skills transfer well. It's always tough when you have a first language and then you have to learn to read in a second language and you never learn to read in a first language. That's why the town of Lexington I live in has a dual language program. Okay. Now, the emphasis with the functionalists, or I call them interactionalists, interaction, is that you're constantly learning the second language and negotiating your understanding. In other words, in school, the teacher may tell you to shut the window. And if you don't know English, you may have to have somebody perform the action. Then you know shut the window means something. You don't even know which words are which, but you know shut the window. In Spanish, open the window would be abre la ventana. They say it very quickly. They say, abre la ventana, por favor. And you would say, abre la ventana. Now, so that's a long word. Well, no, it's 3 words. But because you picked it up in a situation, you've negotiated the meaning. Now, you negotiate the meaning in the nativist approach. But with school, you get to negotiate meaning in both formal and informal language acquisition. Now, there's a little chart in here about second language teaching methods. I'm just going to go over this very quickly. The tradition that came from people, whether they were French or whatever language they used to speak, and even the Middle Ages, educated people spoke Greek in the world of the Romans. And later, educated people spoke both Greek and Latin, which is the Roman language, the Roman Empire. And so if you were an educated person in the year 500 AD, you certainly spoke Latin. That was the language of the Roman Empire, but you also spoke Greek because it was the language of the intellect. This persisted even into universities all the way up through the 1700s. Many people were expected to learn their Greek and their Latin. Certainly their Latin for sure. And then there was a lot of frustration. That was a very slow process, and you simply read something and you had to translate it. You really didn't learn to speak and tell jokes in Latin. The last great stand-up comedian in Latin died about 1,500 years ago. So it wasn't a language of the glib. It was a language of the educated. And it was a sign that you were a high society. Now, beginning in the late 1900s or 1800s, a man was putting together language schools in Europe, and his name was Berlitz. And I think he was German, or he could have been Belgian, but he was trying to get people to learn French because people wanted to learn languages. It was the cool thing to do. And by the way, French became the language of international diplomacy and education, probably through the 1500s, well into the 1800s. Speaking French was considered a person of culture. Now, what's interesting about that is that this man hired a young man to teach French. When the man arrived, his French was great. He spoke no German, or he spoke no English, whatever language they spoke at the time at that particular place. And so he went in the classroom and he just spoke French all the time. At first it was very difficult, but I've had the experience of a teacher that used this approach where he just said, we're not using English in our Spanish class in high school. We didn't use English at all. And it was tough for the first few days, but it really was kind of fun to try to figure out things. And by the end of the first year, we were speaking only in Spanish, By the end of the third year, we were actually reading plays from 19th century Spanish literature, very advanced Spanish. And I didn't know it. And I got to college, I found out we were doing junior, senior level college work. So I was very advanced. And that's interesting. You know, you can actually learn more than you can learn in college and high school if you get the right teacher. Now, there were a couple of other systems that came along, and they still kind of exist. One was the audiolingual. And I'll just say that that basically arose from the 1940s. There was a need for our military and our spies to learn language quickly so they could have some language to use. And so what people did is they developed a very systematic memorization approach where you practice patterns by listening to audio tapes. And this was taught to soldiers, to officers, to CIA, etc. And the idea was to, as quickly as possible, mass educate people on a language. Now, the problem was it was very artificial. You didn't actually have a person with you. You listened to a tape, and usually people would just go, they'd go to sleep. So it didn't work very well. But that's why you find all these old language labs around, and you find these approaches where you listen to a tape and repeat after me. That's audiolingual, okay? Now, they made this Rosetta Stone, and that has visual, so it's like a movie. And that's pretty pleasant. It's not bad, but it's always better to learn from a living person in a living culture. You know, Rosetta Stone's good, but it'll never replace having a live speaker there. And then they had an era which is recent, and that's where I basically call it communicative, the real life situation. This is where you are aware of the interests of the learner, and you try to create lessons that focus their attention. For instance, one of the best ones I've seen is, some of you have had this last semester, was the they call the Dartmouth method. It was a gentleman that, I can't think of his name right now. He would speak to you and act very dramatically, very intense language. And there was so much speaking going on that everybody in a room of 10 or 15 people, each of them would get 60 different responses an hour. So you were actually pulled into the action. You could not sit on the chair and just look at the teacher. You had to respond all the time. And that's one of a series of, because we want, you know, what we're doing right now is not going to make you jump off your chair and fall down in excitement. I mean, if I did that, I'd be on television more. Like I'm on television more. Anyhow, so what do we know about this? So we know that the movement is toward making language comprehensible to those who are trying to learn it, not make it too difficult for the beginners, but make it practical so that they can apply it and make them feel that we know what we know and we enjoy knowing it. Like I know how to order a beer. I know how to order a room in a hotel. I know how to ask for help on the automobile. I know how to write a note of thanks to someone in Spanish. These are things that, you know, a cultured person should be able to do, operate in many ways. So let me go over this again. We have a predisposition to learn language. There's a few human beings in the world that actually have a genetic defect of some sort of disability. They cannot learn any language, even their first language. Okay. Another thing, mistakes are good. They show that you're trying to learn. And any class that discourages the production of errors in language is going to be a failed class and a poor teacher. You have to have meaningful, positive experiences in learning. You have to have, you learn to listen first above all else. People don't, it's hard to measure listening. You know, I'm going to give you a listening test, and it can be done, but it's not done very often. And you have to have many, many repetitions that you're exposed to the language. So that's on, I think, my fifth thing there. Why is this not going down? Okay. Now, in the United States, I've got a couple of little places here, how languages are learned. Now, the first language versus second language, I have this on a frame. I think it's like number 6 on here, looks like. You learn a first language in the home. You learn a second language usually at work or at school or when you're older. You're older when you learn a second language. You're not a child. Now, there are people live in bilingual homes or trilingual homes. That's different. They'll learn, it may seem confusing. And by the way, these people say learning a second language interferes with your intellectual growth and other language production. That's nonsense. It doesn't interfere. It may cause a little confusion, but a child that grows up with 2 languages is much sharper, and I believe that, smarter, because their brain has been programmed so many different ways and so many new connections. Remember this, our brain is a neural connecting unit, and the more stimulation it gets, the better off it is. Positive experiences cause neurons to grow. Negative experiences cause you to shut down and not grow. And that's the bottom line on that. And your brain, by the way, does not stop growing. It continues to grow and network all the way through when you're older. It may seem slower, but I don't think so. My own experience is I'm smarter now than I was 10 years ago. Okay. Not conceited, smarter. Okay. Learning is mostly first language is unconscious process. Actually, you can learn second language in a very unconscious way, but most of us are too uptight. We're on our defensive. You know, when you try and learn French in French class, you're worried about what you look like, especially if you're younger and you're worried that you're going to make a mistake and people laugh at you. If you're Hispanic and you're learning English for the first time in the United States, you're worried about being laughed at. You're worried about making mistakes. First languages are learned without pressure. Your mother does not withhold milk from you if you can't say dada or mama. Second languages, there's more pressure. But if you're going to teach ESL or any foreign language, you have to realize your job is to make learning a pleasant experience. And that's the bottom line there. That's another bottom line. Instruction should be comprehensible. It's next frame. I think it's frame 7. It should be challenging the students. It should be interactive. Okay, so there's a number of things we need to do to make this language learning acceptable. You should include literacy. And I'm a believer that every lesson should have a listening, a speaking, a reading, and a writing section to it. Sound like a cat getting sick. I'm in Richmond, my son's house. Hope the cat's not puking. I hate that. Increase comprehensibility, increase interaction, increase thinking skills, and increase student intellectual development. That's all very important. Allow access to mainstream curriculum. Academic language must be learned in an academic course. And it's all going to be very, very pleasant. I'm just going to hit through some of these. I believe content has to be taught simultaneously with language. None of this stuff about we're going to learn English and then we're going to go back and make up for all our classes we missed in math and social studies. That's why it's very important in the ESL classroom. Students get into a regular classroom as fast as possible. They still have to they have to be introduced to the culture. They have to know some language, just basic functional stuff. And the big stress will be on the mainstream teacher, whom you as an ESL person or your supervisor, you want to see good cooperation. You want to have mainstream teachers that are positive, not people that say, oh, God, I don't want those ESL kids in my class. I'm just going to ruin everything. You know, we don't say that with special education. And, you know, people used to, they say, oh, I don't want those sped kids in my class. It'll be too difficult. They need to be off by themselves. Segregation is virtually never, unless there's some safety issue, there's no reason for segregation. Yes, it is hard, and teachers should have, some people have paras that assist them, and that's okay. Okay, I put down the social versus academic language here at the end. That's Bix and Kaups. You can read about them. Social language is just as critical as formal language. You need both of them. You can't say, well, one's more important than the other. Now, the one thing I do want to emphasize, and I'm going to jump over, this is huge, this chart. It takes 2 to 4 years, and sometimes less, for an ESL person to be able to speak pretty proficiently in a second language. Young children can do it faster because they're sponges. They just pick up everything. Their brain is moving around and it wants information. Here's the problem. Academic English takes longer. This is not because our brain can't function. It's because the nature of the teaching system that we use, and this is my opinion, this is not, I do not believe that academic language would have to take longer, but it does, because we don't use it all the time. Kids need to be exposed to tons of reading at their appropriate level so they can make rapid progress. They need to have a lot of listening practice. They need social interaction. You cannot give them books and have them do round robin reading, things like this, if they're not at that age group, if they're not at that reading level. It's just going to frustrate them. If you can look at a student and basically say, oh, that student's really not engaged, then you've got to change the teaching approach. It doesn't matter if they're not engaged. It doesn't matter all your big plans. You know, they're dying on the operating table right in front of you. Okay, so it takes 5 to 7 years for academic language. Could be a little less, could be a lot more. Social language can be very rapid. I've seen it in just a few months for young children. But certainly if you are engaged, and this is why the social aspect, if ESL kids, whatever their situation, if they are ignored, excluded, or there's bias against them, or people are afraid of them, or they just don't ignore them, they will be isolated and they will not make progress. You cannot talk about academic success unless you see them having social interaction. That's a tough one to manage. This means there has to be opportunities. You have to work with the family. Mainstream teacher has to work with the family. It is my hope that all ESL teachers, all mainstream teachers will get ESL endorsements, not just for money's sake for me, but that if they know significantly how to work with ESL kids, those ESL kids will be much more successful. They learn just like any kid learns. There's nothing magical, really. It's very important to have a positive attitude about their first language. Don't demean their speaking of their first language. That's one of the worst things they used to do historically, is actually spank kids for speaking Spanish or whatever language. At the Indian schools many years ago, students were beaten and humiliated for speaking their native language. They were shamed. So that was a horrible. You can't do that. Positive school climate with respect for the culture as well as the original language is very important. And you need teachers that love diversity and are not afraid of it. And it's not just younger teachers that are better at it than older teachers. It's just good teachers, okay? All right, now I'm going to stop right there and give you this podcast for tonight.